Hi everybody, here's another video that looks at specifically how to read scientific articles. It's a little different than how I read books or how I read textbooks, so I wanted to go through the easiest, fastest, let's say, way to get through this. So the biggest piece is to look at scientific articles as sections. So you always start with this section at the beginning called the abstract. This is going to summarize the biggest things. We found no evidence. This is their big point. All their main points are in here. And so this is where you want to start to see if you understand all the words, all the ideas that are going in this. So you start with there after you look at the title and a little bit about where the authors are from to see if this is a trustworthy article. But since I'm the one assigning it, you can kind of guess that hopefully this is a trustworthy article. But some of these techniques can be used when you're trying to evaluate articles for yourself as well when you're doing papers. So you start reading it. I always start with the introduction because that's where they're going to give you the biggest background information. They're going to give you a summary of the main ideas, where this research that they're doing fits in. Well, sometimes you don't know the words. So I always print out the document. It just works better for me. You're welcome to do this in an online version and create a notebook that goes with it, corresponding to page numbers the same way you do with the other things. So a big one to know, a definition to know for this is what phenological means. It's basically the dates of a life cycle. So phenology for plants tends to be when trees bud for the first time in the spring. For animals, it's when they make some sort of behavioral change, they hibernate, they wake up, something like that. And so you want to go through, and I like to circle and really make definitions in the margins for the words that I just can't seem to remember, especially if I see them more than once and I can't quite remember a good definition to hold on to. So the other thing I tend to do as I'm going through is make sort of notes for what mismatch means, for what other ideas mean. So for me, mismatch means that it's the timing of something. So the food doesn't come out, which means at the same time babies come out, which means that the babies will die. So there's a mismatch between the phenology of when food arrives and the phenology of when babies are born. So if those two things don't coincide, you're going to end up with dead offspring. So the introduction is a key point. Then you kind of look at the materials and methods. Unless it's a big part of your study, you don't really need to look at this very deeply. So you can look at this because it's interesting. Basic studies, where they're looking, they're going to give you some definitions, what a resting spot is, what their FID or flight initiation distance is, things like that. You can usually find it in the materials and methods sections. The graphs are always a good place to get a good amount of information in this piece underneath the graph. The results section can almost always be skipped. You can skim through it. So one of the things that you tend to find is where they've sort of compromised on their data. So 16 of 19 hares were eaten. So all of their data is based on only 3 rabbits or hares. So you can go through, as you can see, there weren't a lot of notes that I made as I went through this piece of the results section. But the big piece is when you get to the discussion section. This is where it's going to answer all your questions. And what I like to do as I go through the discussion section is pick out the main ideas. I tend to underline them and then write in the simplest version of what I've read in my own words. So essentially this phrase here, that the 2 studies cite snowshoe hares demonstrated little plasticity for modifying coat color, molt, phenology, or behaviors to track seasonal snowpack, which means they did not change their change their coat when snow arrived. So it was much simpler than the language they're using. This is one of the problems with most scientific articles. They tend to speak very, very specifically, and so sometimes you can't get all the details. So there were some flexibility when they were going from white to brown, but no change or in the ability to go from brown to white. And the authors have no clue why. They don't understand why this might happen. So I went through and started summarizing some of these pieces. You've got the main pieces of the temperature was not the cause of these small changes they found. Snow cover was not the cause. But they did find that there is some flexibility, that the snowshoe hares can be more flexible based on the locations they're in. And then one of the things that they did study that they were trying to figure out is, can snowshoe hares adapt to this on their own by modifying their behavior? And apparently they can't, or they did not. And then the last paragraph of any good discussion, sometimes in some journals they'll call it a conclusion, but mostly it's just the last paragraph of the discussion. And what they tend to do is summarize the big picture. This is the big piece of what they found. Sometimes they'll add a piece that says, here's what studies should be done next, here's what the future is going to hold, or here's the big piece. So that's the basic premise you'd want to use as you're going through researching for papers to use for yourself and for how to read the various articles that we look at for class. As always, email me if you have any questions or are unclear about any of this.